her recent publication, which came out just in 2016. Very, very, very recent. But word has it that Martha was actually here about a year ago discussing her book, which was going to be published. So now we have the finished product, and it's very, very exciting. So just a few words about Martha before we let her take the center stage. She is an alumni of Teachers College with a master's in applied physiology and an EDD in movement science and education, and a registered somatic movement therapist on the faculty of Empire State College at SUNY and Princeton University. She is the founder of the nonprofit organization Moving for Life, Dance Exercise for Health, and she served on the certification program faculty for both the School for Mind Centering and the Bartenieff Institute of Movement Studies. She founded the Somatic Movement Therapy Program and renamed it Dynamic Embodiment SMTT in 2008. Martha Eddy is also the founder and director of the Center for Kinesthetic Education in New York and a co-founder of and the director of Somatic Studies at Moving On Center in Oakland. So we welcome Martha, and with no further ado, we'll get started.
Thank you. And how's that for sound? Can you hear me okay? Great. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I think you may know that we're being joined by about another 50 to 100 people on webinars. So you'll be getting questions. You'll be hearing questions from amongst ourselves as well as from around the world. And I'm excited about that. So welcome to everybody who's attending today. I am going to do my best today to weave in the relationship Teachers College has to this field. And I'm also going to do my best to define some of the terms that you heard in my bio. So by the end of this talk, you'll have a little more understanding of what body-mind centering is, what lava movement analysis is, what the word kinesthetic is all about. Okay, so mindful movement is an important concept. It's the idea of paying attention. Somatic arts has to do with paying attention specifically to the body. And conscious action was my choice. In these days, it feels really important to see how to take anything into kind of community action with a certain awareness. Okay? So I'm going to start with what is somatic education. That's the new field that this book is basically attempting to not just launch, because it's launched before, but kind of pull together. There hasn't been a book yet that's about fields. There are many books about single disciplines, like the Alexander technique or Feldenkrais method. There are books that have interviews across different disciplines, but this one is really designed to give the history of how this came to be a field, how these different individuals exploring their bodies for health and educational reasons basically, hi, welcome, did a similar enough type of work that it merited being called a field. So here we go. The person, Thomas Hanna, that named the field is Thomas Hanna. He's a philosopher, and he was trained in some somatic work. Before, again, this field was referred to as somatics. So he was working with Moshe Feldenkrais and learning about how different kinds of movement can both improve your coordination and change your mind and your thinking. And because of that, as a philosopher, he began to investigate other cultures that had this kind of thinking. That includes the Greek culture in particular. And he found the word somatikos, which means, or the way he interpreted the Greek, was the body as known from within. So we all have bodies, but when we die, we still have a body. The intention here with soma is that it's the living body. It's the body that has built into it intelligence. So somatic education means learning to pay attention to your body in order to improve your intelligence or inform your mind. We actually use kind of paying attention to body signals, not just to feel better or get rid of pain or to do a more coordinated movement, but also to notice a gut feeling, to respond to something emotional, to read body language in cross-cultural communication or just communication with your partner. So these are the kinds of applications for somatic education. And our tools for helping people to pay attention to their bodies more is teaching people about the breath. Also working with very specific types of movement, which often includes having some touch involved, because touch is really the first way we are communicated with as babies. As a matter of fact, the first nerve to myelinate in utero is the eighth cranial nerve. It's the nerve that goes to our inner ear. And people might go, well, so what? Well, the inner ear is not just registering the sound of that siren outside in the New York City streets, but it's registering movement. It's registering the fact that I'm swaying right now, or the fact that I'm tilting to the left, because of the vestibular canals and the otoliths. I don't want to get too detailed today, but I wanted you to give a sense of what part of the body we're accessing for this kind of awareness, okay? So a baby is touched by mom in utero or held by caregivers after birth, and that touch is our first communication. So we use touch a lot to help just bring up more sensation, but it may also bring up body memory and relational kinds of associations. Okay? I'm going to say that if you have questions about clarification, feel free to put your hand up, and then we'll have questions about content and more detail as we go on. Vocalization is another kind of touch, actually. When we make sound, you actually can feel the vibration that it's making. Or if you're playing an instrument, you have a vibratory experience as well. So movement is vibration, breath is vibration, sound is vibration. And vibration creates sensation. And it's the sensation that we're trying to kind of reawaken in us. One of the reasons, and actually I'm going to read a little something from the founder of a dance discipline called contact improvisation. Steve Paxton was in the Merce Cunningham Company and part of the Judson Church postmodern dance launch. And he says, Martha Eddy has produced a significant review of the history, participants, and practices of a field, which in my perfect world would be part of every person's education. It is about our ability to perceive ourselves, to feel bodily movement and structure. So that's the key thing. She opens doors to the importance of the hidden senses, of proprioception and kinesthesia in education, culture, and health. So proprioception and kinesthesia are two senses that we all have, just like we have eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and skin. But how many of you were taught about your proprioception or your kinesthesia when you were in kindergarten? Or how about when you were in college? It might have come up there, but maybe not. It depends on what discipline you're relating to. But this is a basic, what we call it in a more everyday parlance, felt sense or body sense. And having a felt sense or a body sense is important to not having an injury, to interacting with other people, and to noticing when you're hungry, all kinds of cues that are really important about posture and self-care. So that's what the somatic work is about. It's bringing back, or maybe, once again, helping to take off in education the idea that our bodies are important and that we have these senses that should at least be acknowledged. Somatics gets us to use them. The other point is that the movement that we do is often neurodevelopmental. So just as I talked about the relationship with mother and caregiver, the first year of life has some really important movement building blocks. So I hesitated because it's really not just the first year of life. If you take those 12 months plus the 9 to 10 months before that, and then maybe for some kids, they're not standing or walking at 12 months, so 14 months. So we're really at 2 years. But those 2 years are incredibly important for neural stimuli, brain development, the acquisition of movement skill, motor skill, and language. Think of all those things that are going on. So there is a lot of use of early movement patterns from the first year of life, birth to standing, as part of the somatic work. And the idea has to be tested out. We really need research in this. But it was postulated by the Yale Study Center back in the 20s and 30s that different parts of the brain are being stimulated by these different movement patterns. Okay? So I've used the word kinesthetic. So the kinesthetic approach, kinesthesia, kine means like cinema. Kine and cine, they're the same, means movement. So moving pictures, kinesthetic, our kinesphere, the space we move in, is really important in somatics. So proprioception is our ability to feel our bodies in space and know what position we're in. Kinesthetic awareness is teaching us about how we're moving as well, not just what static position, but our motion. So why bother listening to the body? Why use this kinesthetic approach? Well, this is kind of review already, in order to have better coordination, in order to gain self-awareness of your body, but also of your emotions, your feelings, because our bodies give us cues into our feelings. And to increase expressive capacity. And that can mean dance and theater and music, or it can mean just how I'm communicating, because I think many of you know, although the research varies, that at least 60%, and some groups say 90% of communication is nonverbal. Okay? So our capacity to be in touch with our bodies and to use our bodies for expression is actually pretty important. So again, I've said some of these things, and I'll be repeating myself a lot so that it funnels around. Learning through somatics includes movement, but it also includes perception, using the senses. So having tactile input is one way to feel my body more. Actually, sometimes in teaching this work, we might pay attention to light changes as well, or as I had you do, noticing sound, like the siren outside. So it's about becoming aware. It's multifaceted, both in the use of both external sensory input and internal sensory input, and in its application to physical, emotional, cognitive, and aesthetic choices. How does this relate to mindfulness? Well, some basic kind of tenets of mindfulness are the concept of being present, which is basically not being distracted. So we want to be present. We want to be aware of how we're feeling, thinking, and being right now. So that means in practice of it that we have to kind of pay attention to what we're experiencing right now. And that practice is something that has to be cultivated for many of us, because our culture doesn't really teach us that so much. More and more, we're beginning to have more of a sense of presence built in as a recuperation to the really busy urban lifestyles that we're leading. But it's still pretty new. I'm pretty happy with how many people now are practicing yoga, for instance. So that practice is a chance for people to settle back, breathe deeply, feel their bodies, and also become more mindful. Meditation is another way. So these are really critical kind of inroads to becoming more present and not worrying about the future and not worrying about the past. So somatic modalities are also working towards becoming more present, and becoming more present again by paying attention to our physical sensation. That really puts me right here in this room right now with you. If I'm paying attention to myself in the moment, I have to acknowledge I'm here, and so are you. Okay? And with that, I'm developing my physical awareness through proprioception. I might be improving my movement. Right now, as I became more present, I was like, oh, how am I standing? You know, what am I doing with my posture? It also, in turn, can help reduce pain. And I have to say that for people who pay for somatic movement experiences, sessions, it's usually because they're in pain or they want to enhance their motor performance. So they've got to be pretty motivated to contract such a session, you know, to set it up, because right now it's outside of our healthcare system. It's not something we have readily access to for free, unless it makes its way into education, which is part of the reason I wrote this book, to help to make that happen. On the right side, I'm also talking about a process of discovery. So even if you have a teacher of somatic education, the process is ultimately yours because it's your body. Teachers are basically facilitators and guides. They're not lecturers, really. And ideally, they're going to be asking you probing questions that you answer, and you decide whether you believe that experience to be true for you. So truth is something you begin to wrestle with a little bit. I'm feeling like my shoulder's up, and I want to relax it down, but it's always up. I might start to think about, okay, how do I use my cell phone? And then I might also be asked by the person working with me, the somatic educator, well, do you have any emotion there, or do you have any other association with that? And I might say, yeah, I get cold a lot, you know, or that I'm scared. There are all these different kinds of things. So those are 3 different possibilities. 2 out of 3 might be true for me, 1 might be true, or none might be true. It's really up to each person to decide how to use these cues and clues. The other outcome of the somatic work is that you have more choices. So I have the choice now that I know that my shoulder's lifted to either keep it lifted or to relax it. Now, if I'm very tight, I might only be able to relax it that much. And it takes a certain amount of movement and retraining of the physical body to actually break a habit, because muscles retain information for efficiency reasons. You know, we have our patterns and our habits, and they work for us. And if we think it's working, we keep it going, so we don't have to think about it, and we can be creative and write music or write our essays or do our exams. But sometimes pain comes along and says, I need to let go of something. And sometimes we need guidance to find out where the kind of lack of balance or flow is. I want to weave in how my motor learning and movement science work has interfaced with this work, but also to acknowledge that for all the founders of this work, they were really scientists and artists. It's kind of exciting. We have physicists, we have biochemists, we have actors, we have dancers becoming physical therapists. And so the work is a real melding of personal experience, of anatomy, kinesiology, and motor learning, as well as some of the ancient practices of yoga, tai chi, qigong, and more recent, and a little more recent, not 5,000 years old, but Haitian dance, as well as Aikido, which is a newer martial art form that started in the 20th century, things like that. I'll come back to this again. So it's steeped in science as well as the ancient forms. It's interesting to me right now. I was at the TC Memorial Conference for Antoinette Gentile. So the motor learning department brought together a lot of experts, and the research is so exciting. And one of the highlighted outcomes of that conference was that right now the research is showing that if you have a goal-oriented movement, it's actually more helpful to have external cues for feedback rather than these proprioceptive cues. And I had to kind of wrestle with that. How do I make sense of that? Here I am espousing that we should be paying attention to our bodies more. But actually, if you're paying attention to your body in the middle of throwing a basketball, you might be distracting yourself from the measuring process between yourself and the external environment. So I think that's the main key. One of the things that you'll hear me repeat, and I'm beginning now to say, is that somatic work is about sensing. But at some point, we need to then connect the sensing to feeling, what might be going on in our bigger kind of holistic life. And then at some point, we have to let go of that and just act. Let that very set of patterns that are habits become subcortical again so that we can function. So I believe that a lot of the research being done in movement science is more functional movement because it's easier to measure. And with functional, goal-oriented movement, you really do have to just act. You can't be busy sensing or maybe get too distracted by your feelings. Okay, so we'll come back to that. My hope is that as we move forward in the movement sciences, that the functional and the expressive will come together more. But again, the research in human expression is very complex and harder to measure. So part of what was implied in what I was just sharing is that we're working with external cues as well as internal cues. And that actually becomes a basic principle of somatics. A goal is to balance inner and outer focus, to know when it's time to go in, to know when it's time to go out, or to know how to kind of check in a little within, but just the right percentage so it's not distracting you too much from being in the moment and active. Okay? So it means sometimes to get into our somatic selves, we actually need to just close our eyes and pay attention only to our bodies. And that's what newborns do. When they're first learning to coordinate their vision, for instance, they open their eyes and are very still and just look around. And then they close their eyes and just feel their body. So I'm going to just take a moment and ask you to either palming, if you like, or just sitting up with your eyes closed. Just take a moment and notice your breath. So let this be a somatic moment. You could do a body scan from your feet up to your head, if you like. Just how are your different joints feeling? How is your breath moving through your body? So that's a very internal focus. And now I'm going to ask you to open your eyes and just as you continue to listen, see how that kind of proprioception that you just practiced informs how you're listening for the next 2 minutes, okay? And we'll keep shifting. So a big part of somatic work is that we're working with different parts of the nervous system. I'm using language right now, and dialogue, conscious dialogue, is part of somatic education because as we experience different things, being able to name it and describe it also helps us recall it and review it or decide to let it go. And that would be in the central nervous system, in the high brain, the cortex, that use of language. Some of the reflexive action that happens that may either get us into trouble because we are too reflexive all the time or not reflexive enough is more in the spinal cord. These are control centers, and the brain, especially the cortex, helps us process information, but there's also processing going on in the midbrain, taking in information from the eyes and ears. So how we use the brain really varies. And what I want to get at also is the peripheral nervous system, that we have lots of nerves, and the nerves go out and in. They bring us information in, that's that sensory part. But they're also helping us guide how to respond, and that's the movement part. And it could be the movement is speech. So when I'm talking, I'm moving. Even without my hands, I'm talking, I'm moving. Just using my vocal cords is movement. Breath is movement. And then there are the nerves going into the organs. And that, again, might be where we start to feel butterflies in our stomach or palpitations of the heart, anxiety, or a sense of, oh, I am calming down my breath, it's slowing down. So we're reading all of those different parts of the nervous system. One of the implications of what I mentioned before about living in modern urban life especially, but I think it's trickling down urban life into rural life and just the idea of mechanized technological society, is that we're able to move really fast and we're allowed to connect with a lot of different people and have a lot of different thoughts going through our heads. Lots of phone calls coming in, emails, wherever we are. And so there's a lot of input, lots of sensory information coming in. And we do need to recuperate. Rest is a great way to do it. But doing somatic movement is a way to recuperate and also still kind of teach your body how to stay inactive, how to be able to do your work and stay relaxed. Okay? So this is working with the nervous system at all levels, kind of low brain, midbrain, taking in information, high brain, processing, talking about it, reflecting on it, and using both the sympathetic nervous system, which is really about, kind of dealing with stress, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which basically I call siesta time. Okay? So we have lost our siestas in our culture, mostly, and it's too bad because we really need to spend time resting after we eat in order to maximize the nutrition coming in. So it turns out somatic education is really nicely, it dovetails with relaxing and kind of reconnecting with the parasympathetic nervous system, the part of the nervous system that goes to the organs that has to do with digestion, repair, and healing of body tissue. And the way we do it is by asking people to slow down. Often to lie down. It could be on a table, could be on the floor, could be just relaxing against the wall. Breathe deeply, slow down the breath, and then begin to release tension. So those are some of the basic activities of somatics. There are 3 branches that I identified in somatic work. So these tenets, this slowing down and noticing the body, possibly feeling more support from your chair or the floor, or your feet if you're standing, breathing and releasing tension, could be used in a somatic movement class, which again could be specifically a class in somatics, or it could be a dance class that uses somatics, or it could be a physical theater class, or it could be any kind of, there are Alexander teachers that work with musicians so that they can organize their body better for breath and flow and articulation of the fingers. So those are the types of movement applications. It can be in sports, it can be in anything. Child rearing, working with children. So psychology, as you can imagine, has a lot to do with these kind of early connections that are being made with our parents. And then the somatic body work, and somatic psychology could also be about the present and tension and how to deal with tension, where's that tension coming from, and working psychologically with some of that. To do that, so somatically would be pay attention to body language and to slow it down and kind of interpret messages that are coming from it. Or the somatic psychologist might say, it'd be really great if you actually get some body work as well. And let's coordinate what you're doing with your body worker together with the psychologist. So one type of body work is zero balancing. It just happens to be, I had a picture of it. So Smith is great, and he's doing a little touch work there. For somatic movement, which is going to be the, the main center point of this book, we have the first generation pioneers. And here are the approaches. I've mentioned some of them. The Alexander technique I've mentioned, Feldenkrais awareness through movement, Traeger approach. You may not have heard of Rolfing. You may have heard of his body work, but they also have a movement component. I was trained by Bartenieff. She's one of the dancers who, she was married to a Jewish man living in Berlin in 1936 and needed to flee Berlin. They came to New York, but couldn't get work in dance at the time. And that's partially because there was kind of an anti-German sentiment. So they both trained to become physical therapists. So she applied her training in somatics with her teacher, Rudolf Laban, that she was doing in dance, then to physical therapy. Sensory awareness is used a lot in meditation practice. It was really developed more at Esalen, if you've heard of Esalen. Charlotte Selber is the founder together with Charles Brooks. And then Gerda Alexander was in Europe, had an illness, thought she was going to New Zealand, and ended up in New Zealand, which is Denmark. Spent the rest of her life in Denmark. She got like a student exchange or an opportunity to go try to be in better climate. And she's amazing. She basically said, you know, I'm going to breathe differently to heal myself. I'm going to let my bones relax. And she went very deep, deep inside her body, not just to the muscles and bones, but really into physiology. And her work is called eutonie, which means harmony of your tone, relaxing your tonus. So it's back to the relaxation idea. I left out Todd because I wanted to center on her because her work really influenced us here at Teachers College. So one of the points I really want to drive home today is that somatic education is really experiential education. Somatic education is adult or child education that keeps you in the present and you're doing something to learn. Okay, so here's an example. Mabel Todd was involved East Coast, West Coast, Emerson College, working with the voice, had various different illnesses and accidents, and like many of the others in this story, kind of went into a room on her own until she figured out how to heal herself. And in her case, she worked with imagery. So she said, if I just, instead of thinking about good posture in the mirror and checking, if I just have an image of a fountain flowing up and then flowing down, it just sort of falls into place with that gestalt. So she worked with, and it was named by one of her students who was here at Teachers College, Lulu Zweigard. Lulu named it Ideokinesis. So again, Kine, movement. Ideo means idea. So the idea of using ideas and images to facilitate more coordinated movement and posture. So here's a kind of schematic of how Mabel Todd has influenced education here. There is a woman, Margaret Dobler, who came here in 1918 to study, and she was a physical education major, and she heard that there was incredible learning at Teachers College. So she got to study with John Dewey, and she got to study with Alice Bentley, who was a musician at Carnegie Hall, and a few other amazing people, including some of the art educators that were influenced by the East. And she went back to her physical education department and created the very first dance education department in the country. And it was at the BA level. Later on, she was using, because she got there for decades, she used the book that later came out by one of the teachers that she had heard and learned about, which was Mabel Todd. And Mabel Todd's book is called The Thinking Body, and it is still used today as a text in the somatic world. Lulu Zweigard continued Mabel Todd's work here at Teachers College in something called the Movement Lab. And she taught anatomy, but the way she taught it was experientially. So this is the key. We're learning science, we're learning about the body. It could be a course on biology, it could be a course on motor development, it could be a course on anatomy. And these things can be taught through feeling, okay, if I want to know where my biceps muscles are, this is a concentric contraction, it's tightening. This is an eccentric contraction, I can feel it's lengthening. That kind of technical knowledge, for me, for instance, becomes much more easy to remember if I have a physical sensation of it. Other courses about movement have been taught experientially since. So here's a picture of Lulu Zweigard in our TC movement lab doing some anatomy. They're actually putting together the pieces of a skeleton. And so that's another way to be more sensate, to actually feel the different parts, to know where they go. I often, in my teaching, I teach anatomy for dance at Princeton. I'll just take a disarticulated skeleton and say, you guys put this together. What's the right way it should be formed, right? And they're like, you know, you've got a femur next to a radius. And I'm like, I don't think so. Just look at how that articulates. And then we get it right eventually. So I'll come back to Mabel Todd a little later, but I wanted to make sure that got covered. And here's just a picture of F.M. Alexander, the Alexander technique. In his case, he was an actor who lost his voice. And the story goes again and again, the medical profession couldn't really help. So they said, I'm sorry, you're just going to have to give up your acting career. And he said, there's no way. You know, impassioned about this. So he went from Australia to New Zealand to England, and he spent time in front of the mirror figuring out what was restraining his voice. So in his case, it was a mechanical issue, and he was able to reorganize his musculoskeletal system and his neuromuscular connections in order to speak clearly. And it was such an aha that he ended up making a system out of it and sharing it with other actors. Does anybody know who was his kind of premier student from here at Teachers College? John Dewey. So John Dewey worked with him a lot, and he wrote the preface to some of Alexander's books. So part of Dewey's understanding of experiential education comes from having had this tactile assistance, this awareness of his own body. Okay? And Dewey talked about how this would be really important to get into schools with children. And Ted Diamond, who teaches here in Mind, Body, Spirit, is one example, and I'm going to give you others, myself included, who have taught more somatically here at TC in more recent decades. So what is somatic education again? It can be either self-taught, that's how the founders discovered it, and again, I call them wildflowers. If it's a field, it was a field of wildflowers. There's one in New Zealand, and someone else in Seattle, and someone else in New Zealand, and in Denmark, and then somebody else in New York. Different people discovering that if they paid attention to their own bodies, they could heal from different kinds of injuries, or limitations, or challenges. And then they figured out how to transfer that information to other people. First, one-on-one, you often using some kind of touch, but it's not absolutely necessary. And then developing how to use it as a group skill. So, in order to be a system, it has principles. There's often specific exercises or guided activities. Remember, I mentioned it was more about facilitation. So doing things and then saying, how does it feel to you, is a big part of somatics. It's giving the choice back to people, which is a kind of empowerment. Here's another one of the progenitors, Milton Traeger. He was a boxer. He was having his athletic trainer help him. And then he popped up off the table and said, wait a minute, let me show you what I need. And he started doing it on the athletic trainer, and the trainer said, my gosh, your hands are like magic. You know, like, can I lie down and get a session? And so he developed a technique that actually involves a lot of just jiggling to loosen up the muscles and calm the nervous system. But he also developed mentastics, which is mental gymnastics with the body. And his tenets were freer, lighter, softer, which is a theme for all of us. So he's a happy guy, and he became a doctor in order to deepen his work, a medical doctor. Okay, so this work has health implications. For the people that had no medical solutions, for walking, speaking, breathing, they spent time with themselves, just getting back to their relaxed breathing, three-dimensional, neurologically primal selves. And that focus on self is important because it's about taking your health into your own hands. So anybody can do this. And what's implied is that our bodies have a self-regulatory capacity. So for instance, when I work with kids with ADD, attention deficit disorder, or ADHD, hyperactivity disorder, a lot of what I'm doing is just helping them be more aware of their bodies and being aware of when they're going really fast and when they need to slow down and how to get faster or how to slow down, which gets back to that vestibular system coordinated together with the muscles and the rest of the body. This implies that the body has its own desire to heal. And unless we get in our own way, which can happen, basically this can be a very effective tool. Other goals is that you're learning to do something for yourself, and you're learning through doing. So education is key in somatics. It is an educational process. Somatics is not something where you go to someone and they fix you. You go to someone and you learn about yourself and you make your own choices based on that. It blends the science of movement with the experience of your own body. And it's a vitalizing process. It brings energy. I call it body-mind work, and that's what body-mind centering is, versus mind-body. This is not about the mind telling the body what to do. This is about the mind listening to the body and honoring the body's wisdom. So wisdom through the body, it's an embodiment process, becoming more embodied, which has to do with this whole new field of embodied cognition. Okay, to find information, it has to be kind of in the present and known. Not always, but it's the theory is that it deepens the quality of the knowledge. We also refer to this as cellular intelligence, like just knowing at the cellular level, not having to go through the cortex really deep. For some people, finding the body in this way and being so honoring of the body is also kind of creating a temple for being alive. And that can lead to feelings of spiritual oneness or a sense of mystery of life. So you'll find a lot of the progenitors are described as being kind of spiritual stimulus for people. Like, even though they don't mean it necessarily, wasn't their intention, people say, I came out of that session and I felt the mystery of life. I felt like wonder, these kinds of feelings. Similarly, there is now a whole new field called dance, somatics, and spirituality, or just somatics and spirituality. And there's a journal on that very topic. And of course, it's awareness of self, which I believe leads to sensitivities to others. It builds empathy. As you get more kinesthetically aware, you can have kinesthetic empathy. You can kind of feel what someone else is feeling. And of course, you have to be careful not to do too much of that, take on other people's pain. But it's great to be able to be more sensitive. I just want to show you that from the 8 people I showed you in the beginning, there have been other generations. And the second generation is more women who were dancers. So this field has had a huge impact on dance. I'm not talking about that so much in this talk. I'm going to try to wrap it up quickly because I know you want to hear your questions. So this is kind of a review. We're paying attention to sensations, and we're also making meaning from them. So you're taking a moment to go, well, what is that? That lifted shoulder mean? Am I cold? Am I tense? Or am I just using my phone in a bad way? Right? That kind of thing. Making time for and choosing to focus on yourself. Allowing the soma to heal itself. Practicing self-awareness. So practice is the key word there. And then applying that to everyday activity and communicative movement, nonverbal communication, is a kind of active mindfulness. So the practice of self-awareness, feeling my body, is part of mindfulness. Not getting distracted by the body and just being present with the moment is another part of mindfulness. And then using mindfulness as you pick something up or put it down or look at somebody or type can be a way to add mindfulness to your everyday life. So back to TC, I talked about the movement lab and ideokinesis and experiential anatomy. I've mentioned that Dewey's constructivist approach includes this kind of mindful somatic knowledge in his own embodied self. The dance department has always had a Laban movement analysis course, which Rudolf Laban was the teacher of Irmgard Bartenieff that I mentioned before, who developed dance notation. So in the way that we have music notation, we have dance notation. The reason I bring that up is in order to develop a notation, you have to have a strategy for what the components of movement is. So he thought every movement involves the body, okay, in space. So knowing where you're going with a dynamic. I could be doing the same movement lightly or with strength and quickness, and also with a certain what we call shaping factor. So that's the broad stroke of his work, and it's very detailed, and you can record any human movement, whether it's someone writing to someone doing some kind of athletic performance or a group of people. Also at TC, we've taught Skinner releasing. I was brought in 1990 to teach movement retraining, which was a course that was on the books, and I'm not sure quite what they were teaching in the beginning, but it was, I think, just an overview of somatic work. I narrowed it down because I felt the dance department, but also people would come from anthropology and other departments, psychology, needed to understand neuromotor development in an experiential and embodied way. So I picked the Bartenieff and body-mind centering approaches to that. You can learn more about what those are by reading the book. And then right here we have a faculty member that is using an embodied approach in working with leadership skills. And she's got her workshop, Embodied Leadership for Women, but also in her courses in adult education. So thank you, Carmela. Great to have you here. And so grateful that you're keeping that work going here. We don't have a dance department. I left when the dance department closed. We'll see what happens when the dance department reopens. I'm sure you're going to be seeing a lot more somatics here at the school at that point. I don't know if you know, but there's a new doctorate in dance, so we're very pleased about that launching soon. So the second generation in this circle that I showed, as I mentioned, were often dancers. Don Hanlon Johnson is the one that wrote many books on this topic, often interviewing some of the early pioneers and the second generation. This is Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, who was my second teacher. I had Irmgard Bartenieff and Bonnie Cohen. She's alive today, and this is her husband, Len, a chiropractor who gave up his professional life to really stand behind her work. So they've run quite a wonderful school called the School for Body-Mind Centering. This is just another map of the same thing. Here are all the teachers, Nancy Toft, Joan Skinner at Skinner Releasing, Anna Halprin, I need to mention, because she studied with Margaret Dobler, and her somatic work is called Life Art Process. So it's a psychophysical process using art and dance to get at healing. She healed herself, or at least recuperated really quickly from pretty severe cancer, and has stayed alive. She's 96 today and still dancing. I got an email from her 2 days ago. And she and her daughter, Daria Halprin, have this school at Tamalpa in Marin, California. She was part of the Beat Generation. She worked with Jack Kerouac and Burroughs and Ginsberg and all of them. She was the dancer. She was also really, really isolated after living in Boston, in Harvard, in the Bauhaus community, diaspora of her husband's architectural world in Marin. So she would go into San Francisco, and in San Francisco, she was one of the really first conscious, deliberate projects to get people of different races together working on different themes. So this was in the 60s and 70s. So she's been a political activist from the beginning, and she does a lot of work around the environment and was hugely important in the AIDS epidemic, helping many, many people with AIDS. Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, I've mentioned. Sandra Frale taught at SUNY for many, many years, and within SUNY was able to bring the somatic work in. So it's a very important model of public education, integrating this work. And she has written a lot of books on phenomenology and Butoh as well. Emily Conrad unfortunately died very recently, but she was the person who studied with Catherine Dunham and was so moved by that dance form that she went to Haiti and lived in Haiti under the dictatorship and really got politicized by it, but also learned how to work with the dance form that kind of bypasses tension and moves through flow in such a way that she's helped to heal many people that were very spastic from strokes or cerebral palsy or other kinds of issues. Elaine Summers also just passed away. I'd say that's my biggest regret about this book taking 15 years to write and publish, was that Elaine and Emily did not get to read it before their deaths. However, I'm very pleased that Anna and these others are happy with it. And Judith Aston, she's another amazing story, and so is Judith. Judith applies her work to fitness, which is really cool. And then you can see that each have had students, so there I am, having developed my dynamic embodiment work, putting together Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen's work together with Irmgard, my two teachers, create a new system. So I call the next level the amalgam generation. We put a lot together. Joan Skinner, just some photos and how it impacts dance. I'm not going to do a lot with dance, but here's Rudolf Laban. His student was Mary Bigman, so you'll hear about Martha Graham as the mother of American modern dance, and you hear of Laban and Bigman as the parents of German expressionism in modern dance. Dance at TC, I mentioned already. Margaret Dobler studied here in 1916. Here are the teachers, physical education. There was some creative dance work here. And then she studied the biological sciences formed by Mabel Todd. Here's a picture of Anna Halpern with Margaret Dobler, the student from TC, the 96-year-old woman now. And then I have to mention Martha Myers, because she was the person who brought all of this work to the American Dance Festival, but she did it in a very important way. When it got to Duke University, she would bring the doctors to these classes, and she would insist that they do the somatic work. So she has been a founder of not just dance somatics, but also dance medicine and dance science. And so we have journals, and that's a whole field too, that really holds the somatic work as important. And here's an example of me teaching undergraduate students that have a dance requirement at their college. They're not professional dancers, but they're learning about support and neurodevelopmental movement, and they're having fun, and they're pretty much blown away. Such that they brought me back the next year to have them perform with just 2 rehearsals. And the name of the concert that they commissioned me for, they gave me the name, was Dance, a Healing Force. So they got to tell their healing stories. And you can see it's equal men and women, which I just love. Because this field has become more female dominant, and that happens a lot with things of the body, nursing, childcare, elder care, and the like. So it's great when men are interested and stay involved. Emily Conrad's picture I put in here, partially because she's finding support, not just from the floor, the walls, or her hands, but from nature. And that's another big part of this work. It's connecting back to our ecosystem, our ecology. So there's a whole wing of this work called eco-somatics. Here's an example of an Alexander teacher touching a dance student while working. So I'm just going to reiterate sensing, feeling, and action. So somatics really has a lot of sensate time, connecting to feeling, and then going into action. To me, it's not that different than being reflective in a class. So when we take time to reflect on what we've learned, we're in the experience, we're recalling it, we're bringing the body and the mind together. And then we're making connections, and then hopefully we're using the information, transfer of knowledge. Okay, here's some somatic bodywork terms in case you are interested in that world. And for instance, the body-mind centering has a lot of hands-on work. Functional integration is the name of the hands-on work of the Feldenkrais method. So many of them have both. And here's an example of Emily Conrad doing hands-on work on Bonnie Cohen. So 2 of the founders of these fields sharing their knowledge experientially. Here are some of those other fields. Sorry that it's hard to read. It says subdisciplines of somatics. Bodyconsciousdesign.com. You can check it out if you're interested in shoes, houses, equipment. Like, how do we pay attention to our bodies in the designing of things? Eco-somatics, I just mentioned. Somatic fitness, Judith Aston, Emily Conrad, myself have all applied this work to personal training. As a matter of fact, the field of personal training came out of Bartenieff's work. The first one-to-one fitness training were the first students here in New York City and in California. And then look at where we are now, personal training. You know, lots of people have them. And somatics and spirituality I mentioned. Often these are kind of signaled by having either a conference or a journal or a website. So you can find most of these online now. I want to end with, you know, given our times, how somatics help in dealing with challenge. One challenge is just about how to get somatics out there, and it's expensive to take classes, as I had mentioned before, so that's a challenge. But we're trying to get it into public education. I have a nonprofit that applies it to working first with women with breast cancer, but now through movement and exercise to anybody who wants to do kind of conscious movement. It's called Moving for Life, and it's a .org. The word somatic, though, when I go to tell people that it's a somatic-based fitness and dance program, might not mean something to somebody, because somatic means voluntary muscle nerves, or it means psychosomatic, which actually divides the mind and the body, or it might be used, it might be the name of an approach. But in our work, we're redefining, re-explaining the early roots of the word as soma and the living body, the body that pays attention to itself. And the idea here that I want to end with is that much of the work is improvisational. It's both experiential and, as I said, guided versus dictated. It's more inductive versus deductive. And so you're learning to be more responsive as you become more sensate and more aware. And that becomes very helpful when you're dealing with crises or challenges. And then we want to be able to take that skillfulness that kind of becomes subcortical, autopilot, to quote my friend Julie Ludwig, who was also the Skinner releasing teacher here, and be able to just use it. I'm going to read one section on somatic, social somatics, using the word somaction. So social somatics implies taking context, culture, and relationships into account whenever practicing and applying somatic education. It can also include striving for somatic models to become embedded in all aspects of life, and also in actively countering inequalities. Making somatic education available to all people who would like to pursue this type of inquiry is one example. Thus, a key point is that social somatics is a form of activism. This concept is encapsulated in somaction, a term I coined at Moving On Center, my school in Oakland that is now run by Carol Swan, called the School of Participatory Arts and Somatic Research. Here, students spend many, many hours going deeply inward, and then they're asked the question, somatics for what? Okay. So the idea is to begin to share the work. And you can do that by taking it into action, standing up for your gut feelings, caring about self and others. For me, that relates to the bullying work I've presented here for you in the past. My doctoral thesis was on the role of physical activity in violence prevention in education settings, working with middle school and high school students. So the idea that as we pay more attention to ourselves, our empathy grows, and we can work to use this work in working against intolerance and other kinds of issues, which will be discussed this Thursday and Friday with the Human Dignity and Humiliation Studies group that I've become involved with. So social activism using somatic awareness can be called somaction. It's the ability to act from an inner sensitivity. It's concern about equity and fairness. It's about advocating for all to have health, environmental justice, and economic justice. It's compassionate action with concern about equity and fairness. I'm saying it again, advocating for health, environmental justice, caring about the earth, and recognizing the need for economic justice as well. So thank you. Yay. So we're probably over time. I'm happy to continue with those of you that can stay to take any questions. And I don't know how it's doing, Paulina, whether anybody's burning over there with the webinar. Okay, great. Does anybody want to ask or say anything? And if you need to leave, I totally, that's fine. Okay.
I was just thinking while you were talking about the story about the first oboist of the Chicago Symphony. I don't know if you know his story, but he had vocal dystonia and he had to quit. And basically he could play his instrument, but these fingers weren't relaying what his brain was telling them to do anymore. So he literally quit for 10 years and went on this journey of a lot of what you described to figure it out. And what he came to was he just had to they rebuilt his instrument to trick his brain into thinking he was playing something else. And now he literally won that job back, and he is, again, the principal oboist of the Chicago Symphony. And no doctor could help him. Nobody was helping this situation of playing like this, and then he just had to trick his brain into thinking his fingers were on a different key, and then he literally could play his instrument again. I was just thinking of it while you were talking.
Yeah, that's great. So it reminds me of Oliver Sacks's book. So for instance, you have somebody without any proprioception who's got a severe scoliosis. So if they have no proprioception and you don't have the time to really teach that, this is an 80-year-old carpenter. He had been a carpenter. So Oliver was great. He really asked, what are you interested in? What did you do? He says, I'm a carpenter. He goes, okay, you wear glasses. Let's put levels on your eyeglasses. So he would adjust his posture using the visual cue. So yes, this is that multi-sensory invitation, so that we don't have to just be stuck in any one sense. We're using all of them to come up. And the mind, and reversals, and the eyes, you know, we reverse what we see in our brains. So some people need opposite glasses for that as well. Okay, thank you.
I come from a motor learning background and was also at the same conference that you mentioned. And I'm a movement instructor, and I am struggling a little bit with the idea that on the one hand, we want to develop consciousness in our clients and patients to develop better, safer movement habits, more effective movement habits, but at the same time, based on a lot of the work in that conference, discussing the idea of giving the tools for our patients and clients to become more self-efficacious in the sense that they can derive solutions for themselves rather than constantly requiring a lot of that internal feedback, so they can react to the environment in a more confident and externally focused way. So figuring out the balance between giving them the awareness and the consciousness, but at the same time also preparing them for activities that are, you know, require that the perception and the action working together. So when you said bringing things to the subcortical level,
yeah,
and that balance, I'm curious how you deal with that issue.
That is the theme. That's the balance of inner and outer focus, and it's the sensing, feeling, and action idea. It's like proportions, like a certain proportion amount of time to get the new experience, and then there really has to be the transfer of learning time. So how do I learn? What do I do to practice together with my therapist, or my maybe physical therapist, or my movement trainer, or my movement instructor, so that I can begin to apply this new way. So for instance, in the Alexander technique, people don't bend over this way. That's compressing all the spinal nerves. You really flex at the hip joint, where the nerves are going to be nerves of the legs, not your entire spinal cord. So it's called the monkey. And, you know, that's culturally kind of counterculture, especially for women, you know, to have their buttocks going back. But it is much healthier. So figuring out what clothes it's appropriate to do it in, what context to do this in, and when it's really better for your body to be flexing at the hip joint rather than bending at the waist. So you learn it. Oh, this is a new sensation. Yeah, it does feel better. Then you have to try it out in different contexts and work with it. And then hopefully it just becomes automatic and you just make that choice. And now you're on to the other things, which is using all those external cues. So I don't see them as mutually exclusive. I see them as really working together, but it is about proportion of time, and different people have different amounts of time. And unfortunately, in physical therapy, for instance, you only get 30 minutes with your clients, so how much can you do? It's very tricky. It's interesting hearing about people having longer sessions. Carmela, you had a question. I know you have to go, so do you?
No, I didn't.
Oh, I thought I saw a hand up. Okay, that was you. Okay, good. All right.
Yeah.
And thank you. And I want to keep struggling with this with you, because it's really important.
We do have a question online, and a few people saying thank you for your time, wisdom, and experience.
Thank you.
The question is, have you looked at studying collegiate sports student athletes use somatics in their daily practice?
I personally have not, but I'm very happy to report that one of my colleagues, Janet Hamber, worked with their college basketball team and in the school she was at in Lawrence, Kansas, University of Kansas, Lawrence, and was nationally televised for how, in particular, the Bartenieff work. Let's see if I'm doing kind of Bartenieff work with these kids here. This would be one of the Bartenieff exercises, learning to take weight on your hand and then walk through your hands. And what I loved about it is I learned this with her when she was 76, 77, 78 years old. She taught me how to jump and fall and all kinds of other things. So that work was then applied, the jumping, the falling, the relaxing, the use of body distribution of weight, how to sit on your sit bones and not slump too much, how to do cross-lateral movements. These are kind of fuzzy, I know, but I could demonstrate, was what helped these National College basketball professionals really succeed. She also worked with track and field. We have other friends in ice skating. And yeah, there should be even more. I've done work with basketball teams more around bullying, actually. The LA Lake, the folks in Oakland brought me in to help them work on just treating each other more nicely. Great.
We have another one online. He says, I'm a Feldenkrais practitioner in Boulder, Colorado. I've done some work applying for research grants, and I'm curious what you think about the prospects for different somatic methods to join forces in obtaining research funding, as opposed to each method or lineage having to prove itself individually to the scientific community.
Thank you so much for that question. I spent 15 years with the development of a professional association for our field, and it has a name. It's called ISMETA, and it's a long acronym, International Somatic Movement Education and Therapy Association. ISMETA is better, is what I like to say, and ISMETA is .org, so definitely check that out. The need for research is huge, and I came out of the incredible legacy of Teachers College work in qualitative research in human behavior. I worked with Bill Anderson, and I'm very proud of that work. And yet, for many shifts in the world, in order to really do convincing arguments, we need more quantitative research as well. So understanding that spectrum of the qualitative into the quantitative and back again is really important. And it would be great to have you join us with ISMETA on the Research Council to see what could be done. ISMETA brings together people from all of these influences and includes the International Feldenkrais Federation. So, that's great. All right. Anybody else?
Yeah. Have you written about your work with bullying in this book?
It is a small section, so I have a K-12 section. Thank you for asking. I'll just take a moment and just say kind of how the book is outlined. And by the way, anybody here can go online and get the book at 20% off. If you remember this code today, PR Mindful. Okay, so you would have to go to the University of Chicago Press and enter that code. So I start with the influences and development of somatic education, so all this history, and it includes a real rich look at physical culture in the 17, 18, 1900s in Germany and Europe. It was called the movement cure, and there's all sorts of things like Pilates came out of that work. And then global roots of somatics, looking at Asian and African influences. Then the second part is the emergence of the field, somatic movement education and therapy, which is what ISMETA brought, and looking more at that second generation, dynamic approaches to well-being in dance and fitness, the women with pink circles that I outlined. And the third generation, the amalgams. And with the amalgams, we started to look at what are the principles for the whole field and develop a scope and practice for the field. So there's a description of, really what is the field. Then it goes a little bit into some history that may or may not interest you, but they're wonderful stories of how this work developed in Britain and at the University of Illinois in Urbana. And then pre-K to 12 education. The last section goes into the neuroscience, so healthy movement, healthy mind, neuroscience connections to somatic healing and action, then into the social somatics, conscious action and social change. So in there's a section on violence prevention. But there's also a section on bullying and violence prevention. So these were mentioned in the K-12 section. And then the final sections are somatic dance and environmental activism. It tends to be the dance world that's doing more with activism, and I'm really proud of that. In some ways, somatic educators that are working just on functional movement or health don't have quite the same kind of performance, lion energy of getting out there into the world. So the dancers are the ones that are making artwork that is having a big impact. In particular, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention global water dances. Globalwaterdances.org is an invitation to each and every one of you, whether you want to come as a spectator or as a performer, to really look at the violence that we were doing to the earth. And so, for instance, we've been very active, supportive-wise with the North Dakota pipeline. by having site-specific performances about whatever your local water issue is. We'll have people in Flint, we have people in 200 countries around the world, or sites around the world in different countries. And you could go and just be the video recorder if you wanted. The date is June 24th, 2017. We do this every 2 years. It gets completely uploaded through YouTube, so you can track it online, and it's been a force that I'm pretty proud of. And then finally, I just talk about, what is this? Oh, and then that also relates a bit to the spirituality. So there's a section in there, like how does it just is interesting that the people that are paying attention to nature seem to be the ones that are also going towards a more spiritual connection. And if you would bear with me, since two people that knew my father are in the room, I would end with reading something he wrote that is in this book. How does that sound? I love it. So I have, for Moving On Center in California, and those of you that are from the Bay Area or willing to fly to the Bay Area, we have a somatics training that's in 4.5 days, starting at the end of January, every 2 months through November. Great way to get into this work, including the more political perspective on it. So our reader for the course is a big fat book. It's called Selected Readings in Participatory Arts, Studies of the Body, Somatics, Culture, Creativity, Dance. Sorry, I gotta read this again. Inside Selected Readings in Participatory Arts, that's the name of our school, Studies of the Body, Somatics, Culture, Creativity, Dance, Movement, and Social Action. A course pack for Moving On Center, published in 1995. There are slips of paper with comments by Reverend Norman Eddy, happens to be our father, a congregational minister. The first page begins with a list of words, and it says on the top, new vocabulary to be defined. Movement therapists, somatic movement therapy, tissue types, somatic, cybernetics, soma. And at the bottom of the page is written, soma. I need a definition. I have known since the 1940s, early 50s, that we creatures are mind, body, emotions, soul, and that our unity as part of creation is in the worship of spirit and the loving of our neighbors as ourselves. Is this soma? Always comes back. In another document called The Great Spirit, She and the Teachings of Jesus, he's a congregational minister, he muses, recently I was talking with my 2 grandchildren about the Spirit. A memory from my school days when I was 8 or 9 suddenly came to mind. We were told that the American Indians believed in the Great Spirit. I immediately understood it to be the positive force in all life, all creation. I believed in it. It had nothing to do with Christianity or the Bible or church teachings. Then 2 weeks ago, I read essays about qi, given to me by an acupuncturist who is both treating and educating me. This ancient Chinese concept, which teaches the universality of the positive energy that flows through the whole body and the whole being, struck me as being akin to the Great Spirit. As I've been reflecting on my own experiences of the Spirit ever since my amazing hour on the road to Damascus in Syria in 1943, I see once more the universality of the Spirit. Certainly, qi came before Christ. I don't know how long ago the American Indians experienced and believed in the Great Spirit, certainly long before they ever heard of Christianity. I have always been drawn to people who know the Spirit and to others who manifest the spirit of love, of truth, of beauty, of openness to all total humanity by their lives, but who in their commendable, rational search for the truth are in conflict with much of the phoniness and often the injustices of the churches and their Bible teaching and theology. I often agree with them. The challenge for me is to help such people learn that qi is already working through them, that the Great Spirit is universal, and that Jesus' teaching about the Spirit coincide with and enrich these two. That's one way to look at this work. So I don't know if that's soma or not, but it's something to think about. Anything else? Are we closed at?
I think, yeah, that's a few questions here. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Sara. online audience. And of course, many thanks to Martha for sharing her wonderful expertise with the TISA community. Thank you, Martha.
And just so you know, you're welcome to come up here. If you have a copy of the book, I can sign it. Otherwise, I can tell you about how to get it. And there's some pictures and things to look at. So I'll be here for a little while. So thank you, everybody.
And please help yourself with information. We have cookies for you. And so it's
Ask.